Washington isn't that good a tactician, but he comes to an elemental strategic insight. He doesn't have to win.
Yep.
The British have to win.
Yep.
And if he can sustain the Continental Army and avoid annihilation of the Continental Army,
Yep.
Eventually the British will decide it's not worth continuing.
Yep.
And that's pretty much what happens. And that's an elemental insight. It's called a Fabian strategy, after the Roman general Lucius Quintatus Fabius in the Punic Wars, who it's quasi-guerrilla tactics. It's not quite guerrilla because he's got a regular conventional army there, but it's a recognition that the strategic center of the rebellion, or what we might call the insurgency, isn't a place. Right. It's not Boston, it's not Philadelphia, it's not Charleston. They capture all those places, not New York. The strategic center of the rebellion is the Continental Army. And if he can hold that intact and avoid fighting except when he's got superior numbers and a strategic, or tactical advantage, then ultimately the British will eventually give up. We don't really win the American Revolution.
Right.
It's the British decide to go leave.
Yep.
And they have a lot invested in this war, and that, the war that's most comparable is the Vietnam War. Only the British are the Americans in this particular case, and the Americans are like the Vietnamese. And the British really come to the conclusion early on that this war must be won for a reason akin to the domino theory.
Right.
If we lose North America, we lose the Caribbean. If we lose the Caribbean, we lose Ireland. If we lose Ireland, we lose India.
Yep.
And it's this notion that everything's at stake, and therefore they're willing to spend enormous amounts of money and resources. And they have a delivery system, if you will, a banking system, a logistical system, a military profession that's much more sophisticated than anything that the United States has. One of the things that I got out of the research in this book is how unbelievably fortunate the United States was, because the states often refuse to meet their quotas in terms of money or troops. There's a hard core of 3,000 to 4,000 young men who serve for the duration.
Right.
A significant portion of them are African Americans.
Right, right.
About 15%. It's the last war in which African Americans serve alongside whites, not in segregated units, until the Korean War.
Yep, yep.
That's an amazing thing.
And not somehow that's a fact that's been hidden in American history.
Right, right. And it's also one of the reasons Washington starts to think differently about slavery. He's commanding a lot of African American troops that are fighting bravely.
Yep.
But these 3,000 or 4,000 guys aren't representative Americans. They're ex-slaves, they're indentured servants, they're recently arrived Irish or Scottish immigrants, they're fourth sons that don't have any inheritance. They're not yeoman farmer types. And they won the war. I mean, it's as simple as, if they hadn't stayed together and been the nucleus, the Continental Army probably would have dissolved. And I can't understand why they did it. Because they didn't get anything for it. The pensions that were promised them were never paid. They starved throughout most of the war because they weren't provided with food on any kind of regular basis. They were in rags. When the British Army marched out at Yorktown, they laughed at the Continental Army. Yeah. Because they looked like a bunch of ragamuffins.
Didn't he play something called The World Turned Upside Down?
They say that. We're not sure that really happened. There's different sources on that. And the British commander didn't want to turn his sword over to Washington and wanted to give it to Rochambeau, the French commander, instead, because they were embarrassed at losing to these people that looked like they were just, bums. Yeah. And yet, this is the group that won the war. And that story hasn't been told. Washington won the war by being the commander-in-chief that stayed the course for 7.5 years. But these guys at the core of the Army, what he calls the soldiery, and he said it at the end of the war. He said, if someone ever tries to write the history of this, they will be accused of writing fiction, because no one will believe that a group of poor young men, ill-clad, ill-fed, sustain themselves for this long against a much superior force, and they did. So Washington gives them credit.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.